it has different meaning, different connotations for different people. Me, I've experienced racism on both sides of the coin. Growing up in an African American neighborhood, being a very light girl, I always got into many fights and always got picked on because I was one of the lighter girls. Based on the audience analysis, many of you have not experienced racism, but how many of you have been stereotyped? Phil, can you tell me about that experience?
Well, just being younger, you always get stereotyped like you're not responsible, you're not, you aren't intelligent, nothing. No one respects opinions.
And how that makes you feel?
Very bad.
Very bad. Okay, anyone else? Julia?
When I went to college in Washington, we got discriminated against because we were white against all the Hawaiians that were there, so we couldn't be included in things.
And how that makes you feel?
Just like I didn't belong.
So today I'm going to talk about racism against African Americans in particular. And though racism is different from stereotyping, it still makes people feel horrible. Racism was meant to make blacks in particular feel inferior to the dominant culture. Now, I know this is a sensitive topic for many of you. Some of you might say, well, some of you might feel guilty about the past, and some of you might feel like you have nothing to do with it, so who cares? But my point is not to, neither one of them, my point is just to make you all aware and educated on this topic. I chose this topic because I had many experiences here in Oregon, in Portland in particular, that made me raise some questions. One of them are, why is there only 36% minorities here in Oregon? Another question that arose is, why do most Portland public schools that are in predominantly African American neighborhoods do lower on their test results than their white counterparts? Also, my experience of time, many times when we're out with my friends, mainly all African Americans, we go to different hip hop clubs or have different parties going on with the police, and these are non-violent events. Police are always like there, like more than us. There was one time we had like a beach party / car show where people from California, Oregon, they all come and on Marine Drive. Well, the police were on dune buggies, they had horses, and they shut everything down. They shut gas stations down on MLK, they shut different stores down along MLK, Safeway, Popeyes, and everything. So as I began to do some research on this topic, I do understand that Oregon was, and I still believe is a racist state. And I'll begin to give you a brief history on this. On June 26, 1844, the exclusion law was passed here in Oregon that required all blacks to leave the Oregon Territory within 3 years. If they didn't leave after 3 years, they got a whiplashing every 6 months thereafter until they decided to leave. In 1850, the Oregon Constitution gave away free land for people that were coming here as wanted to encourage people to come here, and they gave away free land. But African Americans were not able to get the free land. So there were no free land for blacks at all, they were excluded from the Donation Land Act. And every white settler or occupant of the lands were able to get half of a section of 220 acres, and also if you were African American Indian, you were able to get that also. Also, redlining was common here in Oregon. And redlining is basically a racist practice that a lot of real estate companies and people did that excluded blacks from certain areas. So they would only allow them to buy property or live in property in certain areas, which is kind of like the Albina area. It's a little more complicated, but that's the basics of it. They were pushed up to that area, and so that was another racist practice. And in 1953, this is according to Elizabeth McLaughlin's book called The Cure of Paradise, the public accommodation law was passed, and Mark Hatfield, which was our former governor, he had a lot to do with the passing of the law. So that's just a picture of them when they actually signed that. That took 32 years to get passed, 18 legislative sessions of people going back and forth to the Capitol every other year to try to get this law passed. And that was only about 50 years ago. And then also, it wasn't until 2003 that the racist language was taken out of the Oregon Constitution. In conclusion, many people today don't see Oregon as a racist state. To their belief, this is not significant, but as you've heard from the history of what I've just told you guys, it is significant today. So I'm going to speak speaking of institutional racism, I want to share with you guys a definition, and I would like you guys to read along with me if you don't mind. A definition that will kind of sum up what my point is of residual racism. And if we have time, we'll read it all. If we don't have time, we'll just kind of skip through it. Let me all get it on. Start reading. Do I have a volunteer that would like to read the first paragraph for me? Okay, no?
Residual racism is those remnants and influences of earlier generations of classic racism that continue to affect contemporary behavior. The primary difference between classic racism and residual racism is that the residual form generally lacks the overt conscious application of a link between ideology and behavior. The link remains, however, and has been submerged into individual or collective subconscious in most cases.
Okay, now we're gonna skip to the third paragraph because I probably won't have time for the second. Did anyone want to read that third paragraph?
Therefore, it is possible and common for contemporary individuals and institutions to think and truly believe they are functioning in a non-racist manner, while in fact the lessons and patterns of earlier racial ideology continues to impose its imprints on their decisions and behavior.
Okay, I'll read this next paragraph. Thus, residual racism is even more difficult to eradicate than classic conscious racism. Its forms and manifestations are more concealed, subtle, and sophisticated. It is more difficult to confront and correct because it is more difficult to recognize and identify. Can I get one more volunteer for the last paragraph? Bill?
Okay. The key to understanding the dynamics of contemporary residual racism is to realize the majority culture individuals today do not have to be consciously practicing racist to receive and enjoy disproportionate benefits and advantages within social political contexts inherited largely intact from an era when the ideology of classic racism was official public and private policy.
So now you all should be aware why the history of racism still has its effects on us today. As someone stated in the audience analysis, anyone said it doesn't see race should be jeered. And someone else also stated that we should admit that racism is still alive. I agree with many of you that said, based on the audience analysis, that we should be aware of it and become more educated on this topic. I believe that we should talk about it in a safe environment, and to eliminate racism, it starts with you. Someone else from the audience analysis quoted Gandhi and said that we must be the change we want to see in the world. And I'll leave you with the quote that I used on my last speech. The fight for justice is a lifelong journey. Right at 8 minutes. Questions?
2 minutes. Q&A.
Could you say what's the difference between a stereotype and racism? I mean, like, residual racism.
A stereotype is like basically saying, I shouldn't put that in there, but it's kind of just saying, well, because you're young, you can't do this, or because you're this, you can't do that. And it also kind of falls into racism too, but racism, like I said, is more impacted in our history as far as slavery, as far as like the exclusion law and everything else. So it's different because you were stereotyped because you were black, but you didn't get the benefits of the majority culture. You see what I'm saying? So it was like in public policy and law and just part of life. That's racism. Or is that, I'm told I'm answering it the right way. I don't know.
So you're saying like racism has like evolved throughout history in the second to last paragraph. It sounds like it's a disease that keeps evolving and it keeps getting more complicated.
I think it is. And as we get old, as time has passed, I think that people don't realize that, you know, they get some benefits of past behavior. So it's not to say, well, feel sorry for us or, you know, or feel bad, or it's just the fact that be aware that it is alive and be aware that that history happened and affects us today as far as different policies that are being made, you know, different ways that people look at people, which also kind of falls into stereotypes. Like, for example, the police, you know, we all know pulling over while black, or you might get stereotyped because you're African American driving, so therefore you're going to get pulled over at a higher rate than white people, vice versa. So stereotypes do fall into racism, but racism I think is more complex than stereotypes.
Gotta cut.